Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. In today's episode, I'm joined by Dermot Crowley, productivity expert, best-selling author and founder of Adapt Productivity. Dermot has over 25 years of experience helping leaders and teams work smarter, not harder. And let me tell you, this conversation is full of gold. We dive into what gets in the way of team effectiveness, why it's not just about the tools but the culture, and how to shift from being constantly busy to working with real intention and impact. If you've ever felt like your team is stuck in reactive mode, overwhelmed by meetings, emails, and competing priorities, this episode will speak directly to you. Let's get into it. Welcome, Dermot. Thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Claire. I'm very excited about this. Always love talking to you.
Yeah, excellent. So Dermot has over 25 years of experience working in productivity training and has been running Adapt Productivity for more than 2 decades. He's written 4 books: Smart Work, Smart Teams, Lead Smart, and Urgent. So I'm clearly a fan of Dermot's work. I've got all his books, but very excited to be talking to you today. So let's get into it.
Oh.
So part of the research I'm doing is for my book on thriving teams. And often I talk about the fact that teams need to have some simple team processes and ways of working. So this might be how they meet, the way that they get the work done, how they collaborate. So what do you recommend for teams to really thrive? What's your tips?
So look, I tend to look at everything through a productivity lens or an effectiveness lens. So, I'll give you my answer to that. There are plenty of other answers that would be equally correct. But when it comes to working effectively, I guess one of the things that I believe at the team level is, if you think about the capacity of a team to get work done, and I quite often, imagine that a circle being 100% of their capacity, the problem you have is that the team's capacity gets eroded in 2 ways. It gets eroded internally because individuals don't have good personal productivity strategies and systems in place. That means that there's a lot of wasted time, a lot of wasted energy, and a lot of wasted attention because they're just not working as effectively as they could. So that's one type of erosion. But then the second type of erosion is what I would call an external erosion that happens because we're working with other people. We're working in very complex environments, and there's lots of dynamics at play, and there's lots of competing priorities and all that sort of stuff. And when we do work with other people, the reality is we cause friction for each other. And when I say friction, I don't mean that we're fighting. It's more a friction that slows us down, and it eats away into our capacity to get work done. So every time we send an email, every time we have a meeting, every time we have a discussion about priorities, there's a chance that we're actually dragging the productivity of other people down, or they're dragging our productivity down. And for me, that's the secret of a really thriving team from a productivity perspective. They put things in place to reduce the amount of internal erosion and reduce the amount of external erosion as much as they possibly can.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that there's some individual accountability that happens, but also kind of how they're contributing to the mess or the dynamic within the team that happens too. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And so, like, thinking about the individual capacity, I guess we all have different choices that we can make to be more productive. And what would be your top tips from an individual perspective to be more productive?
Sure. Look, This is just so basic in some ways, but it's still something that most people don't do. I really believe that you have to embrace the technology that you've got at your fingertips to be truly productive in today's workplace. And most of your listeners are either going to be using Microsoft Outlook or Gmail as their main kind of email platform and calendar platform. But often the missing ingredient to that is they're not using the inbuilt prioritization tools that you have in Outlook or in Gmail that help you to get a clear view of your priorities. So having a centralized system to manage everything you need to do, whether it be a meeting or whether it be something that you need to do outside of a meeting, that centralization is often missing. And what people do is they fragment their work. They bury what they need to do in their inbox or in their notepad or in their to-do list or in their head. And it makes it very hard to make sure that you're working on the right stuff at the right time if you can't even see it clearly. So for me, that's the number one foundational thing. Set up a centralized system in Outlook. You can use the calendar and the task list side by side to get a more holistic view of your work. In Gmail, you can do exactly the same thing. And that's a game changer for a lot of people when they start to look at their work in that more holistic way.
Yeah. We can often lose the priorities that we have. And I know that I use lots of different systems. So probably there's an opportunity for me even to streamline some of those things too.
Could read one of my books.
I know. I have actually adopted quite a few things from your books. So thinking about the friction that you spoke about with teams, so how can teams then leverage technology really to kind of streamline their workflow so that they're quite efficient?
Yeah, look, I think the same thing is true at the team level. So if I could just talk within the context of a Microsoft environment, because most corporates will be using Microsoft and it's very easy to explain in those terms. When it comes to personal productivity, the two core tools that Microsoft will promote will be Microsoft Outlook, obviously, and Microsoft OneNote, which is a replacement for your spiral notebook. A lot of people use that to take notes and meetings and to manage information around the role. So I see them as personal productivity tools. And the really cool thing is they talk to each other in a very neat way. So they really do lend themselves to personal productivity. But then at a team level, you also have tools within the Microsoft ecosystem. Now, of course, there's lots of tools in a Microsoft suite, but the two core tools for collaboration and teamwork for me would be Microsoft Teams itself, which a lot of people use to communicate with each other and have conversations around project work or more complex work that they're working on as a team. But you also have tools like Microsoft Planner, which is a very simple project board tool, a bit like Trello or Asana. It gives you a really clean, clear view of the work that the team is working on. But the problem is that a lot of teams are either using these tools very badly or they're not using them at all. But I believe that when it comes to collaboration and teamwork, one of the real key principles is to make work visible across the team. So again, we can't bury this work in Excel spreadsheets or in people's inboxes or in notepads. We need to be able to go in and get a clear picture of what do we need to do, who's working on what, where are we up to with that work, what are the blockages. And I reckon that idea of having that clean, simple interface without too many different places that people need to look, that enables higher quality conversations around the work and the progress of the work, rather than if that work is buried in people's individual systems. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So even though I'm on Mac, we use Microsoft as well. And I know that's a bit of a faux pas. And we used to use Planner, but we've started using Asana as our workflow tool.
Same. That's fine, yeah.
Yeah, but I just think it's so important to make the work visible as a team, because it's a great way of knowing, I guess, what everyone's priorities are, where there's conflicting priorities, where you might be working on the same thing. And it just makes a huge difference to collectively prioritize what's most important to the team. Yeah.
And I think one of the key things there is, like, I really don't care whether it's Planner or Asana or Trello, they all do a similar function. But I think you can have real problems when you have an organization where one team uses Trello and another team is using Planner. So let's agree on a standard set of tools that we're going to use, and that allows that visibility and that collaboration to happen in a much more streamlined way.
Yeah, because I do think, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, kind of the conflicting priorities that happen with stakeholders outside of the team itself as well. So you've sort of touched on this already, but like, what are your tips? And it might be to do with tools, it might be to do with other things for effective collaboration and communication within a team.
Yeah, look, I want to be really clear that it's not all about the tools. They certainly do help us to implement and they enable us. But really, I think we need to step back and take a bigger picture view when it comes to how we work together more effectively. So I reckon one of the key external odors of our capacity is what I call productivity cultures. And I believe that every team works within 3 productivity cultures. You've got a communication culture, and if that is not healthy, there is usually a very large volume of noise, especially email or, Microsoft Teams messages. There's a lot of noise that is flowing around in a lot of organizations. And it's not unusual for me to work with people who are maybe getting 200-300 emails a day, plus all the interruptions through Microsoft Teams. And that's just not sustainable. So when you've got an unhealthy communication culture, it's eroding people's capacity to get stuff done because they're just drowning in noise. So I think that's something that most teams need to work on. You also have a meeting culture. And again, if that's not healthy, then there's too much reliance on meetings, and we tend to have too many meetings with too many people in them that go for too long, that are not well organized. And that, again, hugely erodes our capacity to get stuff done because people then don't have any balance because they're just spending all day in meetings with no time left over to get their other work done. So usually some work needs to be done on the meeting culture. And then you've got what I call your prioritization culture. And if that's not healthy, the challenge is that everything is urgent and everything is reactive. And this is so often what I see. And that's why I wrote the book Urgent, because I was sick of going into client organizations and just seeing everyone running around like headless chickens, complaining about the fact that every day was just putting out fires instead of working on the things that truly had impact in our role. So again, I think we need to work on that because that's a cultural issue. It's not just a personal productivity issue. Actually, it's both. If people have a reactive work style, that's going to make you more prone to dealing with urgency all the time. But it's also a cultural issue because if the expectation in the organization is everything is urgent and that's just the way it is around here because that's the way we work, that's putting a huge pressure on people and really stopping them from getting the important work done. So I reckon that the one thing that teams could do to collaborate and work together more effectively is to actually recognize that those cultures exist and realize that culture is just a set of group behaviors and mindsets. So if you can work on those group behaviors and mindsets and flip them into more positive ones, healthier ones, then it just allows everyone to get the important work done in a more meaningful way.
Yeah. I feel like you've touched on 3 things that come up a lot when I'm working with leadership teams in terms of the communication, the meeting, and the prioritization culture. How can teams kind of shift that communication culture? What are things they can do?
Look, I reckon there's kind of 3 layers to it. So I know communication is more than just email, but the reality is that's probably still the biggest pain point for my clients when we're talking about communication culture. And I reckon that if you can nail the email problem, then you can kind of apply that to any form of communication that's coming in. So the first thing that people need to do is take personal responsibility for how they manage their own email and put good practices in place around that. So some of the things that I would talk about would be getting your inbox down to a manageable level, if not all the way to 0 on a regular basis. So what I strive for is an empty inbox at least once a week. And I just firmly believe that is a way of operating that has a lot of basic hygiene built into it. I'm much more responsive to emails and I'm much more intentional with emails because I don't just leave them in my huge inbox and mark them on red or put a flag in them to try and remember to deal with that later. I've got a system around that. And for me, if I need to do something with an email, if there's a priority in that email for me, I'll either do it, or I'll schedule it into my calendar, or I'll turn it into a task and have it in my task list as a priority. For me, that's about being intentional and lifting the work out of an inbox, which is just a delivery dock for work coming in, and intentionally thinking about what's the priority of this and when am I going to try and do it. So there's a certain amount of stuff there at the personal productivity level that the individual needs to take responsibility for. But then the second layer is they then need to think about, how do I reduce the noise coming at me to begin with? So if you are getting 200 emails a day, don't be a victim of your inbox. Do something about it. There's a lot of that noise that you could automatically get rid of by using things like rules, or you could have a conversation with your team and get clear about when people should be CCing each other on stuff, when we should be using reply all, even when should we use email versus putting a post on a Microsoft Teams channel. Getting clarity around that sort of stuff as a team really helps to reduce the volume of email and the volume of noise. But then the third level is to look at this from a cultural perspective and to think about, what are the team agreements that we could put in place that will hold all of us to account on how we communicate. And my belief is we should be communicating in a more purposeful way, in a more mindful way, in a more reliable way, in a more punctual way than we might be. So there's a whole cultural element that comes to life for me when a team actually creates a one-page charter, or what I call a team agreements document, to specify, okay, these are the things that we commit to around our communication.
I love that. I think getting that collective accountability about how we're going to communicate is really important. One organization that I've worked with, they culturally had set expectations around like when to email, when to reply all, when do you use Teams, when's it more informal, how do you document things. Like, they were really rigorous with that, and it created such an efficient culture, and effective, I will say, as well.
Yeah, it does make a difference.
Yeah. So I want to pick up on the meetings, because I think meetings can be a real pain point for people. Like, if they're constantly in meetings, how do they get the work done? So in your view, why are meetings so ineffective these days?
Oh, look, I think it's kind of down to the fact that sometimes when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I reckon people have just fallen into the trap that they'll throw a meeting at everything, whether it really deserves a meeting or not. It's the only tool that people kind of think of using. It's either let's send an email or let's have a meeting. And I think COVID has certainly made this worse. When we all went into lockdown and we were working remotely, meetings, especially through Microsoft Teams or similar platforms, became really critical to creating connection and keeping everyone in the loop on things. But since COVID, we haven't really let go of that. We just escalated the volume of meetings and we got a high watermark, and we've never kind of come back down. Now, don't get me wrong, meetings are not a bad thing. Meetings are a very necessary tool, but again, we need to use them purposefully and mindfully and think carefully about, is a meeting really necessary here? And if it is, what's the purpose and the outcomes that we need to achieve to make this meeting a good use of people's time? And once we've got that clarity, who really needs to be there to achieve those outcomes? I think that thought process is often missing, and we just go, okay, let's have a meeting. We send the meeting invitation out. We include a bunch of people so that everyone's in the loop and everyone's got a voice. But then you're just putting so much pressure on people's schedules, because the other side of it is so many people feel like they don't have permission to push back and say no, or to push back and say, yes, I'm happy to attend, but can I just attend the part of the meeting that is actually relevant to me? They feel that if they don't say yes, then they're not being a team player. And that's just not true, or shouldn't be true.
It's quite interesting, because I think often working with leadership teams, the effectiveness of team meetings often comes up, and how effective they are. And I do think starting around purpose and the purpose of the meetings. And we often kind of break break up meetings into more operational meetings versus strategic meetings. Do you have any wisdom or kind of secret ingredients to kind of delineate between more strategic meetings and operational meetings? And if so, is it anything beyond what you've already said in terms of the purpose and the outcomes?
Well, I guess I don't particularly think of things in terms of strategic and operational. I think my clients do, but when it comes to a productivity perspective, what I'm interested in is what's the outcome that needs to be achieved, or what are the outcomes? So whether it's operational or strategic, actually naming the specific outcomes that you could tick a box at the end of the meeting to say, yes, we achieved that, so we have done our job here. They could be strategic outcomes or they could be operational outcomes. But if you start with that very specific focus, then you can, number one, make sure the right people are there to actually achieve the outcomes. Number two, you can help people to prepare for the meeting and do the pre-work or do the pre-reading beforehand. And number three, you can actually manage the meeting time appropriately. Those outcomes would then cascade down into what's the agenda, what are the things that we actually need to talk about. But the problem is that we're all so busy and moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour, so we often don't have time to actually plan the meeting in that detail. Therefore, we do that planning in the meeting itself, which is not a good use of anyone's time, and it just tends to waste a lot of time. And one of the things that I hear my clients complain about at the very senior levels is that thing of going into the meeting and first of all, people saying, okay, what are we here to talk about? And then someone wheels out a 47-page set of slides and talks through the slides. It's such a waste of people's time. If you want to give people a handout, send it to them a couple of days before. But a lot of my clients now are putting in a 5-slide maximum rule, and they're giving people guidelines about how do you summarize and condense the information so that we can actually have a conversation about the content rather than reading the content in the meeting.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I'm trying to think of what the company is that does this, where they've got like a reading meeting where they actually have time in the meeting for the
I think
leaders.
it's Amazon. Jeff
Amazon.
Bezos is very famous for insisting on this. So the first,
Yeah,
20 minutes of the meeting is everyone sitting down silently reading a 5-page document so
yeah,
that everyone's on the same page.
yeah.
I,
What's your
I'm,
thoughts on that?
I'm not sure about the efficacy of that in every organization,
Mm.
but I do feel there is a variation of that should be in place for every meeting. So it might not be a 5-page document and you spend 20 minutes reading it, but there should be some form of that quickly gets everyone on the same page.
Yeah, I think it's like beneficial in terms of time, but I know from the work I do with personality styles, still some people will want more time to reflect to be able to come to a decision, whereas some people will be able to just think on the spot
Yeah.
as well. So you talked about the prioritization culture, and I guess you've written a whole book, Urgent, specifically around that. And I think teams are constantly in firefighting mode. They're constantly feeling very reactive, and they're in that busy cycle. I'm hearing lots of clients say they don't have time for the strategic work because they're constantly being reactive. So how do teams balance the urgent tasks with the long-term goals and not compromise on productivity?
Yeah, again, this is something that I reckon needs to be tackled about the personal productivity level and the cultural level. So at the personal productivity level, I think one of the things that can kind of dial down the urgency is just having a proactive approach to your own work. And that again kind of goes back to very practical things like having a centralized system set up to manage your activities and to manage all of that work holistically. So I very much believe in using my calendar to manage my meetings. And obviously, I've got lots of meetings, but they're not all scheduled for today. Some of them are scheduled for tomorrow or later on this week or next week and for several weeks or months in advance. It's the same with my priorities. I believe in proactively scheduling my work so that I've got a clear and focused list of things that I need to do today. But I've also got tasks scheduled for tomorrow, and I've got things scheduled for later in the week, and I've already got things scheduled for next week and beyond. So the idea of thinking about a piece of work and asking yourself the question, what's the next step with this? And when am I going to try and do it? And then making it visible in your workflow. That is a very proactive approach to managing work. What a lot of people do, and they might not even realize it, is they tend to work in two reactive zones. One is the first minute, where they deal with things the minute it comes in. So they've got email alerts turned on. So when an email comes in, it goes bing, and they drop what they're doing and they go and they deal with that email. That's a very reactive way of dealing with your incoming work, and your productivity is lower because of it. But then the other behavior is other things they will then leave in their pile until it becomes urgent and it starts hitting up against the deadline. And now they can't leave it anymore because it's due tomorrow or somebody's chasing them for it. So they're forcing themselves into reactive mode again. So I kind of believe that it's a bit like Goldilocks and the bears, that it's not too hot, not too cold. It's just right. We shouldn't be doing our work the minute it comes in. We shouldn't be doing it at the last minute. We should be doing it somewhere in the middle. But you need a system and you need a mindset in place for that. So there's lots of things you can do at the personal productivity level to help you. But your clients could turn around and go, well, that's all well and good, Dermot, but the problem is that I'll have a plan in place, and then my boss or some stakeholder will come along and say, we need this from you, and we need it tomorrow. And they'll feel like, again, they have no agency and no ability to push back and negotiate that. And again, I think that we need to have some permission to be able to respectfully negotiate our priorities. So giving people the tools to have a respectful conversation around that, and helping them to realize that they don't always have to drop everything just because someone more senior comes along and says, I need this done. You've got to, first of all, qualify, is it actually urgent? It's not urgent just because it comes from the boss. I work with a lot of CEOs who kind of say to me, you know what, I ask people to do things and they do them immediately. And I'm kind of spend half my time going, no, don't make it urgent just because it's from me. I'll tell you if it's urgent. But people make it urgent because it comes from the senior person. So we need to qualify, is it actually urgent to begin with? And then if it is urgent, is there any room for negotiation around that? And there are techniques that you can use to negotiate urgency and to find a way through that is good for you and good for the other party as well. And I think that's often that people are missing those skills, number one, but they're also missing the permission. So I believe that leadership teams need to actually recognize that sometimes they are the problem. And they need to shift their mindsets around this, and they need to open up the space and the permission for people to have these conversations. And when that happens, then we begin to see cultural change around this.
And so do you have any tips for leadership teams to be able to hold the mirror up to themselves? Like, because sometimes they are the problem, or they're creating urgency just based on their authority, role title, or importance. So how can they shift that culturally?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the time it's not even conscious. They don't even realize they're doing it. It's just the way it is. It's become the way that people work. And I think that they need to do some self-reflection and realize the power that they actually wield, and be very careful about clearly communicating expectations around deadlines and things like that. So if they request a piece of work and they don't give any guidance around when it's due, then people will either make the decision that it's urgent because it comes from the senior person, or they'll just stick it in the pile and they'll leave it for later, and potentially you have to chase them on it. So just being really clear and consistent about, this is what I need from you, this is when I need it by, and then open the space for people to push back on that if they're not able to meet that deadline, or they need help reprioritizing other priorities to be able to switch to that particular deadline. So that'll be one thing they could do. I reckon the second thing is coaching their team on some frameworks around prioritization and creating some alignment within the team around priorities. So I guess the challenge that I often see is I see urgency and I see importance as two lenses that you can look at your work through. And in the worst case scenario, what you have are teams who look at everything through the urgency lens, and that's pretty much all they do. They just ask themselves the question, how is this? And if it's urgent, they drop everything and deal with it. If it's not urgent, they stick it in the pile for later on. I reckon that we need to be looking at our work through both the urgency lens and through the importance lens, but the sequencing here is critical. We should be looking at our work through the importance lens first, and then thinking about the urgency. And that's a whole mindset thing. And once people have some frameworks around how do I think about the importance or the impact of a piece of work, and how do I ask that question first, and first of all work out, is this a good use of my time? And then if it is a good use of your time, if it passes through that filter, then you start to think about, okay, do I need to do that today, or could that wait till tomorrow or next week? And that's a very ingrained cultural way of working where people are just thinking about urgency, and it takes a lot to unravel that. But the teams where I've seen them put some real focus on this, it's quite amazing how everything just calms down a bit and people start actually thinking about what's important. How do we all kind of work together to achieve the outcomes we need to achieve? And of course, urgency is still a part of the conversation, but it's not driving everything. That's the key thing.
Yeah. I guess it's the old saying, if everything's urgent, then nothing is as well.
Absolutely.
So in my Thriving Teams model, we talk about how teams need to have a really clear direction. So I link that very closely to what you're talking about in terms of importance. So how can teams be really clear on what's important or what their clear direction is and get aligned on that so everyone within the team is on the same page?
Again, this should be kind of basic 101, but often it's missing. Or if there is some clarity around what's important, it's overridden by messaging that actually diverts people away from that. So you can have organizations who kind of have really good planning and strategy in place, and they work to cascade the priorities down through the different teams in the organization. But then they ride roughshod over all of that by trying to work at pace and still making everything urgent. It confuses teams. You say you want us to work on this stuff, but every day you're forcing us to work on this stuff. I think the first step is to have some sort of cascading planning and prioritization framework in place that helps the leadership team to be really clear about what's important at any given time, and then helps them to communicate the cascading priorities down through the different teams. And that's kind of way beyond my remit. It's probably more what you deal with than I deal with, maybe. But that needs to be in place. But then it's also giving people as I say, the permission and the tools to be able to become accountable themselves, but also to feel like they can make decisions around their priorities because they are informed by the bigger picture priorities, and they've got permission from leaders to be able to do that themselves.
Yeah.
It's not easy, never easy.
Yeah, I think especially with goalpost shifting all the time, or even people operating on assumed expectations that people know what's expected and haven't actually communicated it well.
Yeah.
But you've called out a word which I think personally I'm trying to shift the negative connotations that the word accountability gets, because I actually think it should be a privilege. And I think sometimes the word accountability gets a bit of a bad rap for various reasons.
Yeah.
But I like to think about accountability on 3 levels. So there's your individual accountability. Then there's mutual accountability, which is shared within a team. So it's kind of that shared accountability. And then there's a collective accountability, which happens between teams and stakeholders to actually get the work done, because we don't operate in isolation. So is there any strategies that you'd suggest to kind of help marry those things together in terms of individual, mutual within a team, and that collective accountability?
Yeah. So I guess the thing that comes to my mind is I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier on, which was team agreements, because I really believe that a simple, clean set of team agreements is a great way of, number one, holding yourself accountable to the way that you should be working, but also giving you permission to hold other people to account as well. So I guess the way I think about it is, like, if I was to back right up and say that there was 4 qualities that I mentioned earlier on. Didn't name them as that, but they are the qualities of being purposeful, being mindful, being reliable, and being punctual. I believe that if people show up at work and kind of live and breathe those qualities, then you are going to have highly effective teams. But the problem is that they're kind of a bit airy-fairy and a bit nebulous. Like, how do you get someone to be more purposeful or more mindful? So it needs to come down to a more concrete level. So I guess I believe that those 4 qualities would drive people's good intentions. And I think we've all got good intentions around, we all want to do good work, and we certainly don't want to create productivity friction for other people. So we've got good intentions. But then at the other end of the continuum, I would say that people's actual behaviors are what drive the 3 cultures that I mentioned, which are your meeting culture, your communication culture, and your prioritization culture. And the problem you've got is there's often a gap between people's good intentions and their actual behaviors, especially when we get busy or we get overwhelmed or we get stressed and under pressure. That's when it kind of breaks down. So the thing that creates the connection between our good intentions and our actual behaviors are the team agreements. So if you've got a team agreements document, it holds you personally to account. It helps you to have integrity around how you work. And for me, someone once said to me, integrity is just doing the right thing even when nobody's looking. So team agreement can really help us to be personally accountable, but they also give us the mechanism when other people in the team aren't necessarily following the agreements that we've all agreed to. At least you're able to call it out without making it personal. You can kind of say, hey guys, we all agreed to turn up to meetings on time, but I'm really noticing that it's all getting a little slack at the moment. Could we tighten that up? Because that's what we all agreed to. So I think it helps us to have those respectful conversations and negotiations in the workplace.
Yeah. It's interesting. What I normally do with leadership teams is we work on a team purpose and some values, which are behaviors we're going to demonstrate, which are observable. I think this is almost taking it like a step further, because with, whether it's the team charter or team agreement, in terms of being really clear on the expectations we have of each other. So it's really clear to hold each other accountable to them, which I really like. I think it's something maybe I can build on with the teams that I work with as well. So my next question was about how to hold team members accountable, but I feel like you've already covered it. Is there anything else that you'd add beyond the team agreement to help team members hold each other accountable to what they expect?
I think it comes, probably back to regular communications between leaders and their teams around what are the things that are getting in the way of that. So if a team puts a set of team agreements in place, the problem is that in 3 months' time, that's sitting in a drawer somewhere and everyone's busy again. And that was a great thing that we did a few months ago, but it soon becomes forgotten. I've seen that happen time and time and time again. So I reckon that when you work on a productivity culture, you kind of need to get that plate spinning, but then you need to come back to it every now and again and give it a bit of a spin. So I reckon that probably a quarterly discussion around how we're going with this, what's dropping away, why is that happening, what are the barriers that are in place that are stopping us working this way. That's a really healthy thing to do, but often, unfortunately, we kind of throw training at this sort of stuff and then we think that we've solved that problem and we can tick a box, but it's an ongoing thing. And I reckon that the leaders who really see this as a part of their role. So I kind of think of leadership as being like a rope, and a rope will have many kind of strands to it. And productivity is one of those strands. And a leader needs to build that into their conversation and be constantly thinking about what do I need to do as a leader to leverage the productivity of everyone in my team? Because if I'm not doing that, then I'm allowing the productivity levels to potentially drop away and we all just revert back to the old unproductive way of working.
Yeah, I love that. I agree. I think you've got to constantly be checking in as a team of how things are going, because it could be you've gone through your busiest period, or there's a crisis that you need to navigate, and then some of the wheels fall off the best intentions that you had in place. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, unless you're proactively realizing that having a thriving team requires constant adjustments along the way. It's not static being part of a thriving team. You've got to work on it. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe having a fall off the wagon strategy. So we all fall off the wagon personally and as a team. And as you say, you're so right that a team will be involved in a major project or a major deadline, or something will happen. And that's when it all falls by the wayside. But you can't just walk past that and go, oh, well, let's just go back to the way we were working before. We need to kind of recognize that sometimes in those really busy periods, you need to throw the team agreements aside and just put your head down and get through it. But when you get through it, there needs to be a point where you then come up again and go, right, let's get refocused here. Let's put that back in place. And what do we need to do to get it up and running again? Just thinking through that contingency plan before it happens can make a huge difference.
Yeah. And even I'd add to that, I think it's also having a bit of a review of what do we learn through that, because we might have adopted some good behaviors that only come out in a crisis. Because I think there's other leadership teams I've worked with who galvanize around a crisis, but when it's BAU, they don't really operate as a team. And so it's like, well, how do we learn from some of those behaviors we've demonstrated in a crisis so we can use them without having the adrenaline of the crisis to get us through, rather than just having the right behaviors when we interact just in business as usual.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I kind of mentioned this before, like teams don't work in isolation. They're part of a system and they need to be effective outside the team. David Clutterbuck talks about this concept of teams, or in adaptive leadership, it's more the systemic interactions between stakeholders. But the reality is that teams can't be effective on their own, and they need to balance the expectations and potentially conflicting priorities they might have of stakeholders too. What do you suggest that teams do to balance conflicting stakeholder expectations?
So when I work in organizations, and I'm like you, I'm often working in very large organizations, but I'm often working at the divisional level or at a team level. And while I talk about the cultural aspects of productivity, one of the challenges can be that teams will say, well, look, we're part of a much bigger beast. Our head office is in New York. We can't change the culture of, the whole organization. And I'm very realistic. I'm not a cultural change expert. I'm a productivity expert. So I can't probably change the culture in a large organization either. But I firmly believe in the idea of what I call microcultures. So a bit like a microclimate is a set of localized climatic conditions. I reckon that a team can have its own microculture, and even if they can't impact the whole culture of the organization or the system that they work within, they can at least have some impact on their own culture. And while that might not be perfect, it's better than not doing anything at all. So I often encourage teams to think about the cultural shift at that level. But then, as Stephen Scott Johnson said in his book Emergent, true cultural change in large organizations comes from teams who make the cultural change. They then create ripples that have a positive influence on the teams around them. So I often encourage teams who might have come up with a bespoke set of, let's say, meeting agreements. Obviously, that team is going to be having meetings with stakeholders outside of their team. So, share the meeting agreements with other teams and say, look, this is the way we're doing our meetings. You might find this useful, and just start to create those ripples. And while they might not necessarily spread to the whole organization unless leadership at the very top level picks it up and goes, okay, this is fantastic, let's light a fire and get this across everyone. Unless that happens, it's probably not going to go across the whole organization, but at least it will go across their sphere of interaction, if you like. And I think that's sometimes the best we can do, and sometimes that's okay.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you've made me think of another client who they've got a work day where they've got like focus time in the morning, which is sacred, and you can't book meetings for the first sort of 2 hours of the day so people can get work done. And they've got different, times that you have meetings and kind of wrapping up your day. but they're a consulting firm that consults into other organizations, and then they've got their clients who are booking meetings over that time and how they have to educate them on what the culture is, and maybe it be adaptable based on the client that they're working with as well, who might have different views of what that looks like. So I think it's a constant push and pull in terms of communication with stakeholders and setting those expectations quite clearly. Yeah.
One of the things I'd say about that, like I've got a similar rule in place for myself. I fiercely protect the hours between 8 and 10 for three things. I would plan my day. I would spend some time processing emails and moving stuff on for other people who need to get stuff done as well. So I'm happy to devote some of that time to processing. But I also aim to get my top 3 priorities done before I've even had my first meeting. So I'm really fierce on no meetings before 10. But of course, there are exceptions. But the thing that I try to do is I try to keep the exceptions exceptional, because when I make an exception, what could easily happen is that myself and my EA Chantel slip into the mode that 9:30 is okay, it's not ideal, and then suddenly it's 9 o'clock, and then I don't do that anymore. So I will make very purposeful exceptions. And when I make that exception, I go back to my normal way of working. I don't do meetings before 10, or I don't run training on a Friday. There will be exceptions to that, but they are exceptional.
Have you noticed with teams that you've worked with, when they're creating their team agreements, that they create commitments like that too around?
Yeah, look, I think that is quite often the tailoring that might happen within a team. So if I'm helping them to create a set of team agreements around meeting culture, every team's going to be different because they've got different dynamics at play. So some are dealing with international time zones. There are certain client expectations about meetings. So they will create their own bespoke agreements around that sort of thing. But I do think that, first of all, putting those boundaries in place, and that needs to happen at the personal productivity level. So, I work with so many senior executives who say to me that I spend 90% of my core working hours in meetings. I'm just in back-to-back meetings all day long for weeks in advance. And for me, that's completely out of balance. And they need to create more space for the other things that need their time and attention during core working hours, like getting their priorities done, like being available to their team, like having time to think about their work. And the analogy I'll often use with them is the analogy of a kettle. So if you imagine a kettle, or as my partner Vera calls it, a water boiler, because she's Italian and they don't actually have a word for kettle. She says it's the water boiler.
Yeah.
So if you think about a kettle, on the inside of a kettle, about 3/4 of the way up, there's a line that says, do not fill above this level. I think our schedule should have exactly the same line in it. And I really believe that the more senior you get in some ways, the more you should lower that line to say, okay, I'm happy to give 50 or 60% of my time over to meetings, but I'm actually going to protect 30 or 40 or 50% of my time for other work and being available for. I see a difference between a meeting and a conversation. I see a conversation being a really useful tool in corporate workplaces where we can have a conversation with 1 or 2 people about one single topic, and it's less than 10 minutes. That's a really great way of moving work forward. But the problem is a lot of senior executives don't have the space to have those conversations during core working hours. So that's what I want them to protect time for. But they first of all need to make that decision in their mind and say, okay, I'm happy to fill my kettle up to here, but I'm going to protect this.
The more I'm hearing you speak, the more it makes me think about, like, prioritization is a series of choices that links to the decisions that we make every day. So for teams, why is decision making so important for a thriving team?
So as you say that, I hate doing this to my poor old son, but my son Finn is fantastic, and he's embarking on his career now. He's 24, he's doing a master's degree, but he's also working. But even still, even though he's working in this, I think, quite high level job for his age, he'll often say things to me like, oh, sorry, Dad, I haven't gotten around to that, or I haven't had time to do that. And in my mind, I'm kind of saying, Nah, you did have time. You made choices
Mm,
because you chose to go out with your mates or go to that festival or do whatever you did. There were choices you made. So it wasn't that you didn't have time, you just prioritized differently to maybe the way I would have. And I think that's such an important idea, that prioritization is about making choices and being accountable to those choices.
mm,
And I think at some level that kind of plays out in the corporate workplace. People are busy and they complain about how busy they are, and they get into a lift and they meet their colleague and they say, "Oh, how's it going? Oh, I'm flat out." But busyness is just a series of choices that you
mm,
have made. And when you start to make different choices, like I'm going to protect a certain portion of my schedule, that is you taking accountability and ownership and responsibility for how you manage your time and your priorities. And I guess that's kind of what I would love to see becoming the norm in organizations, where people actually think about this at the top of their mind and they're very aware of what it means to work productively themselves, but also what it means to work productively with others. When people are more mindful about that, and that's why for me, mindfulness is one of the qualities.
mm.
When we're more mindful about that, then we all become better citizens in our organization in a way.
Yeah. And I feel like leaders need to role model some of those choices that they're making or decisions that they're making in terms of protecting time. So, I guess from a leadership perspective, how can a leader most effectively lead a thriving team and navigate the busyness that you've just spoken about so they can lead more effectively?
The trite answer is to do some training
Yeah.
or at least some coaching around this. That's a bit of an obvious one, but I think it doesn't have to necessarily be that. It often just starts with a conversation. So I'm working with a client on Thursday, one of the big four banks. I've got their top 400 leaders at their conference, and I'm running a session at that. And as a part of that, so I'll be talking to these leaders about all the stuff we've talked about today, but at a high level. And I really want to put productivity on the agenda, on the leadership agenda in that organization. And that will then, there'll be a whole body of work that we'll do to support that. But what I really want to have happen is that those leaders go away and have some meaningful conversations within their teams around, okay, I heard this really interesting stuff around, personal productivity, but productivity cultures and how they all interact together. Let's have a talk about this as a team. What do you reckon the biggest productivity issues are for you guys? And before we do any training, what could we do now, right now, to resolve some of those issues?
Mm,
So I'm going to be giving them an exercise to do with the teams after the session, where they choose either their communication culture, the meeting culture, or their prioritization culture. And I'm going to give them facilitate a conversation to have on a one piece of paper, but I want them to go back and have a conversation with the team to just identify that's one thing we could do differently as a result of this. So
mm. I love that because I feel like it's something really tangible and it's probably going to make a huge difference because people probably know what it is, but they just haven't had time to pause, stop, and actually think about it. Yeah.
yeah, and that's the thing, that the really weird thing with productivity is that people know they need it, but they don't have time to do what they need to do to enhance it. But when they actually stop and take the time to do it, suddenly they find they get a lot of time back that they didn't have before. And this is going back to the capacity erosion problem. If your capacity has been eroded at the individual or the team level because you're not personally organized, or you're working in unproductive cultures, do something about it, and then suddenly you'll get capacity back. So before you complain about our team doesn't have enough resources and we're all expected to do more with less and all of those conversations, now hold on, there's a whole lot of stuff on the table here that you're ignoring because you're just not working as productively as you could yourself, and therefore your capacity has been eroded. So that's what really excites me, because it's not hard to give people time back, and they just need to really want it and do a bit of work to get it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I've learned so much. Even after reading all your books, I've still taken lots of little nuggets of gold. So thank you, Dermot. The final question I've got is, if you could leave our listeners with one message around thriving teams, what would that be?
So my one message would be this. It comes out of a piece of research that was done in the UK in 2019. And I do apologize, I cannot remember the people who did this research. But the research was around a concept that they called others-centeredness. So they did this test where they got a couple of hundred people into a room and they broke them up into couples of person A and person B. And they gave person A 5 coins. So let's say $5 coins. And they asked them to divide those 5 coins as equally as they possibly could between the 2 people. Now, of course, they couldn't cut one of the coins in half. So they needed to make a decision about whether they kept 3 coins for themselves and gave 2 to the other person, or they gave 3 coins to the other person and kept 2 for themselves. And they monitored what happened. And they labeled the people who kept the 2 coins for themselves and gave away the 3 coins. They called them, I've gone blank here. What did they call them? You help me here, Claire. They called them other-centered. So if they kept 2 coins for themselves and they gave 3 to the other person, they called it other-centered.
Yeah.
But if they kept 3 coins for themselves and gave 2 away, they called that self-centered. Now, they weren't particularly applying labels, but it was just a useful way to describe what had happened. And then the research led to the idea that teams that had a number of people in the team that had a bias towards being other-centered tended to thrive more, tended to be more productive, tended to collaborate more effectively. So I reckon I really like the idea of leaders thinking about how can we really promote and encourage that mindset where when I can't equally serve my needs as well as your needs, where I can, I'm going to promote your needs over mine as long as it doesn't disadvantage me too much. I love the idea of that it's a very unselfish way to work. Yeah. And I believe that the productivity of the entire group increases when we actually bring that mindset to bear.
I completely agree. I think it will also help silos break down because it's more about the whole rather than just your individual patch as well. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dermot, for your time. I really, really appreciate it and look forward to sharing the Thriving Teams book with you when it's ready.
And thank you so much for the opportunity. Loved it.
Thanks so much.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dermot as much as I did. What really stood out to me is how much of our team's productivity comes down to reducing friction, internally through our personal systems and externally in how we collaborate with each other. It's not about doing more, it's about doing the right things together with clarity. If you're ready to move your team from busy to effective, I highly recommend checking out Dermot's work, especially his book, Smart Work and Lead Smart. And of course, if you're looking to build these capabilities in your team, our Thriving Leaders program is designed exactly for that. You can find all the links in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers, on Audible, Spotify and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.